If you can hear me chew once, if you can hear me chew twice. Okay, if you can hear me chew 3 times. They say if you can't chew and talk at the same time, but I don't know what's going on. Who heard my last joke? Raise your hand if you heard my last joke. All right, y'all. Thank y'all so much. First and foremost, the way that you all are devouring this chicken and stuff is a great segue to say thank you to the people who sponsored the food, and that's Cartograph. Is it Cartograph? It's pronounced Cartograph. And I want to make sure I say this right because I really like the name. Bang the Table. So if you like the food, just hit the table one time. All right, Cartograph and Bang the Table, they sponsored our food. And then I also want to shout out the volunteers again. I want y'all to stand again. The volunteers, the student volunteers, I just want you to stand. You all see how they're all at the same table? I challenge anybody with an open heart to walk up to that table and say, does anybody want to apply for a job like this in this area? For the students, but that's the end of me. I'm going to hand it over to Emily, and she's going to talk about the Innovation Cohort.
Thank you. Hi, y'all. There's so many of you. Oh, my goodness. So I think I've met most of you, but if I haven't, I'm Emily Edmonds. I'm ELGL's second staff member as of April 1st. I think most of you have talked to me as tech support, so when you have a problem logging in, that's me. So my official title is actually Membership and Programs Director. So I want to give you a couple of very, very quick things about membership and then talk to you about a program that we're launching. So our membership numbers, we just want to give you the official count of how much ELGL has grown in the last 7 years. So this morning we hit 4,800 members across the country and in 6 countries. So obviously with that much growth in a fairly short, exponentially fast amount of time, we want to make sure that you guys are all still having a good time, that you're feeling welcome at ELGL events. And so if any of you want to come talk to me, want to know more about membership, helping recruit people, planning events in the future, please come let me know and find me. I will be at the registration desk most of the rest of the day. And then our second, and this is the biggest conference we have ever had by like 100 people. So thank you all for being here and coming. Yes. And so now I want to talk to you a little bit about a program that we're launching. Some of you heard about this yesterday at the Innovation Summit, but we wanted to make sure everybody in the room got a good look at this while you were here because the deadline is coming up soon. So Small Places, Big Ideas is a Innovation Cohort program we're launching right now, and it started, I've kind of been pushing ELGL since I joined several years ago as a grad student to do a lot with rural places and smaller communities because a lot of our folks in bigger cities have more resources to work with, and so we want to make sure that we are serving everybody. I started my local government career in a town of 129 people and mostly spent the rest of my time working in very small towns, so this is really near and dear to my heart, and I'm very passionate about this and really excited to make it happen. So I want to bring up Rich and Austin from Urban Leap. These guys are our partners. They made your awesome notebooks. Give them a round of applause for being a sponsor. So I'm going to let Rich give you some of the details of the program and how this platform works. So the way that we're doing this is that ELGL is managing all of the collaboration in this cohort. We are setting up trainings. We are building out a mentor network for those of you from bigger cities who might want to work with smaller cities for this year. And then sort of helping this group kind of build everything out so that we can present their results at ELGL 20, which will happen next year. And I don't know if we've announced that location yet, so I will not tell you where it is. Urban Leap is the platform that we are using to do these innovation projects around the country. So I'm going to let Rich take it from here.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you all for taking a few minutes of your lunchtime with us. The Innovation Cohort, as Emily discussed, is how do we go to the next page here? So it's a one-year program. It's really designed to bring innovation to smaller size communities, but also, and we're really targeting, so ideally cities that have sort of, or communities that have 50,000 people or less. But having said that, I've spoken to several of you here over the last couple days, and even if you have it's less about the size of your city than it is about where you're at in your journey towards sort of adopting innovation and bringing some of these solutions to the challenges that many of us face. So if you're a city of 80,000 people or 90,000 people sitting there and thinking, well, this might be good for us, please do apply. So don't think that size is a restriction in terms of membership. What this chart shows is that we've got a number of applications already from different places around the country. We're looking to have somewhere between 10 and 25 members of the cohort around a common set of challenges. And what does it mean to be in the cohort? So you'll work under sort of the leadership of ELGL and with support from Urban Leap and a great set of mentors who have already come forward from other cities around the country to pick a set of challenges, a common set of challenges, frame those challenges, solicit proposals from the vendor community that for those challenges. As a group, you will select which ones are worthy of piloting or testing in your communities, and then we'll select those, we'll manage those pilots over the course of a year, again with a lot of support and guidance from both ELGL and Urban Leap and our mentor community. And then at the end of the year, if assuming that those are successful and you're interested, then you can choose to adopt those solutions or not. We've gotten a lot of questions already regarding, so what does this cost? The cost is, in addition to your sort of ELGL membership, it's $2,500 to participate in the cohort. It may sound like a lot, but you think about this idea to sort of collaborate closely with 10 to 20 other like-minded cities with a group of hands-on mentors, testing and actually vetting and testing a set of solutions and walking away, hopefully, at the end of the year with some great learnings, maybe some failures that we can learn from, but hopefully also some successes that you can choose to implement. The vendor community that may be providing some of these innovations, it could be process innovation, by the way, but let's assume for a second that it's a technology innovation. Typically, in our experience, the vendor community will choose to pilot and participate in these sorts of pilots for free. If you choose to adopt one of these solutions into your community after the fact, well, then that's between you and the vendor, of course. But the cost is sort of pretty much all-inclusive, and it'll be upon us as the cohort to select the right partners to work with. So, did you want to say anything else? Oh, I wanted to introduce Austin from Urban Leap. He's my cohort in crime here. We're a small startup based out of San Francisco, but we're working today with over a dozen cities around the country, managing over 250 different pilot projects currently on the platform. So we have a lot of experience in working with cities from as small as Palo Alto, California, to as large as Las Vegas, and everything in between. But we look forward to working with you. We're really excited about this program, and we're really grateful for ELGL's agreement to partner with us on this. We'll be here today and tomorrow, so if you want to ask questions, Austin was kind enough to wear a really bright shirt, so he's easy to spot in the crowd. Please pull him aside at drinks or at the breaks. Talk to him about this program. Again, we really want your participation.
Yay! All right, thank you guys. Let us know if you have any questions. We appreciate your time.
You got it. And then we're going to have our lunchtime keynote. Kimberly, are you here? All right. Give her a hand. Yeah. And then I'll introduce her. She's here. So Kimberly is a part of the Rural Shrink Smart Project, and they're a team based out of Iowa. I'm sorry. That's my second mispronunciation of the day. Y'all missed the first one, I hope. That was a little more obvious. Iowa State University, and what they're doing, they've done research that connects population loss and shrinkage in rural, small and rural communities to quality of life in those same communities. And moving forward in our research, as somebody who's from a small, quote, dying community here in North Carolina, I'm super intrigued to hear what she has to say. So you have the floor.
Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. So the first thing that they didn't say this morning is that there are very bright lights here shining in my face. So I apologize if I look sort of squinty. So I have lots of things to share with you today. The first thing I want to say is that I am an academic in a very pure sense. Never worked for local government, and in fact my background is in architectural history, and I came to this out of a personal and I would say political interest that has become very much more intense recently, and I'm not a specialist on rural Iowa or rural communities, and so I have, I would say, somewhat of a distance. I hope what I say today is provocative and that you'll sort of challenge some of this and talk to me about it and ask questions. It's intended, as I reside in a safe space of academia, to be provocative. And I say that because I want you to understand that for us, our job as academics is to start an interesting conversation, to kind of challenge entrenched notions of things, and I don't have to do the hard work of implementing. And what I'm going to talk about today is work that's so hard it will probably never happen, but I still think the conversation is valuable. So I'm going to try. I've been working on this. Ben knows I've been just kind of struggling to get this together because to try to encapsulate the research project for a non-academic audience is not something that I'm so used to. And I have a lot to tell you, and I want to make sure that as I tell it to you, it comes out in a way that's constructive. So I just want to make sure I say up front, talking about communities that we call declining communities, places where population loss has affected quality of life, and I'll talk about the vocabulary a bit too. These are not easy conversations, and for people who work in cities and towns, a lot of the people here work in places that are the beneficiaries of this shrinkage. You are full of the young people that have left these small places and will never go back. And so this is also part of the challenge of the conversation. You'll hear I have many things to say about this. So, my name is Kimberly Zarecor. I'm a professor in architecture at Iowa State. This research is funded by the National Science Foundation, and I really want to give them credit for taking a risk on us. I lead a 5-person team. It's kind of morphing as we go, and we got a small grant from them to start this work. And for somebody like me who's by training an architectural historian, and I'll say a little bit about that when I talk, this was a totally new experience to be given money to do something besides my own salary. So this project has many dimensions and different people involved, and the NSF, like I said, they're taking a risk because none of us had ever had NSF funding, and we got something called the planning grant, and NSF knows how thankful I am for this, but I just want to say to all of you that NSF really wants to work with community partners, and some of you may be on NSF grants. They have an area of funding that we got our money from called Smart and Connected Communities, and it's relevant to all of you and everything that's been talked about today, so I'm just going to put in a plug for SNCC. So this is the team that I assembled. I'm what's called the Principal Investigator, the PI, and my 4 other colleagues, 2 of whom are no longer at Iowa State, and I'm just realizing that I just got promoted, so I'm professor now. Thank you. So my colleague Marwan Gandour left Iowa State just as we got this money to be director of the School of Architecture in Baton Rouge at Louisiana State, so some of you may be down there where he is. Sarah Hamida is a planner at Iowa State. David Peters is really the core content expert for our project. He is a rural sociologist, something I didn't know existed. And he also has an ISU extension and outreach appointment, and I can tell you more about that if anyone's interested, but Iowa is the founding home of 4-H, and extension and outreach in Iowa is major. We're a land-grant institution. I have a lot to say about that, too. So Eric Rosier has left Iowa State and taken a job in industry. He's our data scientist, and I have a little bit of his work embedded in here, but I'm a humanities person, so the data science for me is not my native space. So, strangely, none of you know me, I don't know anybody here, so none of you know this, but my real personal research is in the former Czechoslovakia. And I speak Czech, and I've studied Czech for 20 years, and I did my dissertation on the history of communist architecture and concrete panel housing in Czechoslovakia. And I have a book on that topic. And I still am very passionately involved with the Czech Republic. So this project came about for personal reasons, and I'm going to add just another tidbit related to the mayor this morning, who talked about his great-grandfather coming from the shtetl in Lithuania. I am another great-granddaughter of a shtetl Jew from Lithuania. So for me, the Czech Republic is part of understanding my own personal history, but for the last 14 years, I've lived in Iowa. And I have 3 little kids, and I cannot go to the archive in the Czech Republic like I wanted to every year. So I decided to build a project from home. And so I come at this as somebody who lives in a smaller city in Iowa, although, as I'm going to tell you, Iowa has very few big places. So Ames has technically something like 60,000 people. The students we don't really know. And it's, I think, the 8th largest city in the state of Iowa. So, it's a place full of small places. So to build the project in Iowa, I needed some kind of research question. My research in the Czech Republic recently has focused on a city called Ostrava. It is a slowly shrinking post-industrial provincial city in the Czech Republic. Most of you maybe have never heard of it, but it's actually the 3rd largest city in the Czech Republic, but it's provincial in everyone's mindset. And my husband calls it the Iowa of the Czech Republic. And it's post-industrial, post-socialist, and between 2009 and 2012, a big research team in Leipzig had a very large grant from the EU to look at shrinking post-industrial European places. Half the cities in the study were in Western Europe and half were post-socialist Eastern Europe. Ostrava was one of the cities, and I became familiar with the concept of shrink-smart places through this project. So I'm telling you this as a preface to say that I took this concept from other people, and I asked the research question essentially, could we look at shrinking places that are rural in a place like Iowa and benefit from the knowledge and the sort of research framework that they developed in Europe, even though in Europe they're looking at very big cities. And what I'm going to tell you today is that after doing this work for almost 2 years now, we would say that rural shrinkage and the ways to be smart and the sort of decline of the places is quite different than urban shrinkage. And I will tell you why, and I'm sort of interested to follow on the announcement that they're trying to do Small Places, Big Ideas training, because I think that sometimes we imagine that cities are the way to teach everybody everything, and we would say in my project that rural places really need a different focus and mindset, and the troubles and the problems are much more difficult and much more intractable than even a place like Youngstown, Ohio. So, point 1, I guess. So, some new paradigms that we're trying to really build up and really broadcast out, and this goes against a lot of what you guys work on. And so I just want to put it out there as up front. So we have an explicit goal to move away from growth as the predominant framework for discussing community stabilization and improvement, and we're talking about growth both in terms of population and also in economic terms. Our research for the last couple of years tells us that a focus on improving quality of life for residents is the best option to stabilize populations. Economic benefits may or may not follow. And why are we saying this? It's because a lot of small towns pay a lot of money to consultants. A lot of states have a big economic development apparatuses to convince all towns that economic development is the path to the future. We want to say no. In fact, most small towns have economies that are similar to other small towns, and there's not a big hope that any of them are going to have a shift in their economics the way that the farm collapse affected, at least in the Midwest, the communities. So, in other words, we have to decide collectively in this rural conversation not to keep making fake promises to towns that there is an economic way to grow the town, both people and jobs. So we propose that the shrinkage of rural populations in states such as Iowa is not something that can or should be fixed in most places. We accept shrinkage. And the research is that we're interested to know how communities respond and adapt to the changes, and to learn from those communities who are doing better than expected in this, let's say, macroeconomic change at the local level. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the should here, that it's not something we can or should fix. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the should, why I think that. But I would just say that it's such a difficult problem. There is a network of small places in this country that was built on the 19th century economy of the railroad, the spatial layout of railroads and horses and carts, and we cannot, there's just no feasible way to go back to the scale of that settlement pattern, which means that something has to change. So, for example, here's two of the towns that we've done some interviews in, have looked at. One is called Correctionville, Iowa, and the other is Hamburg, Iowa. And this is the sort of landscape of these places, or cityscape, if you want to call it that. Correctionville has an awesome name. You might think that it has something to do with a prison. It's much more awesome than that. Correctionville is the place in Iowa where, because of the curvature of the earth, the grid makes a little zig in the squares. They had to actually make a correction in the geometry, and so Correctionville marks the fact that that's where the little zig in the grid happens. So if you're interested in that, Michael Martone, who's a writer who used to live in Iowa and now is in Alabama, he wrote beautiful essays about this. So anyway, so Correctionville is a little town, Hamburg is a little town. So the state of Iowa, here's a railway map, 1904. This is one of the densest rail systems in the country at that time, and I just grabbed this historian's quote now from 1975, so more than 40 years ago. This was written. By 1914, Iowa boasted mileage of no less than 10,000 miles. Recent critics have contended that its rail system was overbuilt, but once every line was necessary in order to breathe life into the burgeoning countryside. John Silver wrote, when the iron rail network was built to completion in the half-century before World War I, the nation needed nearly every railroad that was construction. Every little valley could afford a branch line. In a day when the farm wagon was the main mode of transport, closely spaced lines with depots located every few miles made real sense. And I just grabbed this to say that this is the scale of settlement that still exists in Iowa, and people, especially the ones that we've interacted with in Iowa, where people are very prideful, they protect this scale of development with all of their energy. So in other words, they don't believe that it remains now overbuilt when it obviously does. And every little valley was brought up on the carts and the rail lines, neither of which exist anymore. All the rail lines except for the long distance ones are gone. So all the rail that is in this map is virtually gone, or the tracks are abandoned, I should say. Iowa, believe it or not, and I was talking to somebody here about this earlier, there's 944 towns in Iowa right now. The smallest town, and there's a few of them, smallest towns, plural, 15 people. The largest city in Iowa is 203,000. And about 50%, a little more than 50% of the towns in Iowa have fewer than 500 residents. So we are talking about very dense settlement with very few people still in the dense settlement, if that makes sense. This is an old map before the highways came. The green, red, and blue are the original transcontinental auto routes. The green one goes straight through Ames, the red one and the blue one connecting Des Moines. And this green line is still the main drag through in one direction, east-west through Ames. And in our town, it's called Lincoln Way, Lincoln Highway. Okay, so the shrinkage problem. So the map that says change in population on one side and net migration per 1,000 on the other, the one with the more red is the net migration. I want you to see here a couple things. One is that population change in Iowa is not spread evenly. There are some places that are growing. The turquoise that has what look like little black spots on it, these are the metros of Des Moines, Ames, Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, and Quad Cities, and I'll show that in a minute. Most of the state, though, especially southeast and northwest, and even northeast, they have major shrinkage problems. The net migration map is a kind of flow chart, how many people are actually going. And so you can see such a disparity between the rural small places and the growing metros. So I mentioned just quickly that there's a political dimension to this work for me. This map is the sort of grand statement of why it's a political project for me. We live in a country in which the vote of a rural person matters so much more than the vote of an urban person. The most powerful voters in the country live in Wyoming, 800,000 people in Wyoming, and they are the most powerful. So here's just from the guy who made this map, Andreas Bigar. The county with the largest number of votes, LA County, had 3.4 million voters, had as many votes as the smallest 9 states by the number of votes cast and combined. And so essentially, many of us live in the blue counties, that's my guess, and we are ruled by a political system that's been elected by the red counties. And this is an important thing to understand for somebody like me, a Jewish girl, grew up in Massachusetts, did my PhD in New York City, and I moved to Iowa for a job. And I live in a liberal bubble of a college town. Even Iowa State, Ames is pretty liberal. And I can recognize on this national scale map our county immediately. In the center of Iowa, there are 2 adjacent counties that are blue in the center. That's Polk County, Des Moines, Story County, Ames. Probably some of you can also pick out your counties surrounded by red. And when I talk about politics here, I think that it's very important to understand that some of the conversation about rural communities is unfortunately hostage to the political interests of politicians who represent these red counties. Nobody wants to be the person in charge of shrinking, declining places, and so the only political maneuver to make is to make promises of economic development and economic growth. So for us, we want, the way that we're thinking about this is not to disparage people in rural places, but the opposite. I don't feel that I understand these places. I go to the Czech Republic and I feel like I understand a lot, and I go to a town 20 miles from Ames and I feel like I'm on another planet. And so I think that part of this as an academic is to say that we need to learn from people in these communities what they value, what their priorities are, and why they make choices that some of us feel are counter to their own interests. And so it's a project of learning. All the data that we've collected in the front end of the project has been through interviews with stakeholders in 7 communities, and we went to what we will call the local elites, to use maybe an out-of-fashion term, but people who are in the city government, who might be on the city council, who might run local philanthropies, which we found some of. And so we wanted to know, when you talk to people about their towns, what they had to say. So maybe some of you have been watching. I'm an absolute addict for the New York Times. I read it all day, every day, and on my phone, and I've been so interested to watch since Trump was elected, the coverage of the New York Times suddenly explode with topics that have to do with rural America and Midwest. And I don't know if you guys have noticed the same, but for example, just a few days ago, May 14th, Tom Friedman published this op-ed, President Trump Come to Wilmar, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But back in December 2017, somebody I actually know personally who at the time was working at the Des Moines Register, he called me up and he said, I know you're doing this project about shrinking rural communities. I am writing a newspaper story about childless towns in Iowa. Can I talk to you to get a quote? So he had looked at the data about Iowa and found that there's a handful of places that listed no children as residents. And this was, worthy of the Des Moines Register's news. He was what was called the Iowa Reporter at the time. So his article is titled, Childless Iowa, More Communities Left with Few, If Any, Kids. And here's a picture of two kids who live in a place called Wyota, taking the school bus home. They're the only two kids in the whole town. And there's another town that they thought had no kids, and they went to visit. They went to talk to like the 25 or 30 people there and discovered that because of opioid addiction, 4 grandchildren had come to live with their grandparents in this town, and so there were 4 kids. But there's no playground, there's no school, there's no infrastructure, so the grandfather had built things in their yard for the kids. And so these are at the deepest problem level, Iowa's towns, some of them are so small that there's no kids. On the other side, I don't know if you've read Tom Friedman's column, it's such a good column, he writes a lot of great stuff, but this one is really special, I think. So he found this place in Minnesota called Wilmar. It's in southern Minnesota, it's about 90 miles west of the Twin Cities, and it's a meatpacking town. And its population is now largely and soon to be majority Somali, Latino, and Burmese. And these are groups that exist in the upper Midwest related to meatpacking. And it turns out that Tom Friedman's grandparents, I think, or maybe his aunt and uncle, had a business in Wilmar, and he spent a lot of time there as a kid. But he was from Minneapolis. He's writing about how this community has become very vibrant, and its schools, its businesses, and its culture is totally being reinvented by this immigration, by these new arrivals, a lot of them refugees. And part of his plea to President Trump is to remember that there's plenty of places in the United States that are open to and desiring of refugees in particular, and that the fact that he's completely shut the door to only just a few thousand, I think will come this year, that he's forgetting about all of the places like Wilmar that would be declining and losing people if not for this new population. There's a similar story about Utica, New York. I don't know if any of you caught that. Very similar story last week. And this has just been recurring news. So I just wanted to say this is what Iowa looks like now on the map. There's 3 growing metros, Des Moines to Ames corridor in the center, Cedar Rapids to Iowa City in the east, and then the Quad Cities in the east. And when you look at the highways, this also seems to be where the highways are. And in northwest Iowa, they're very excited because they've just widened the North Highway up there. But our research actually shows this is a detriment to small communities to be close to the highway. It means that it's easier for people to avoid doing any kind of business or finding services in the town because the highway makes it quick and efficient to go other places. So it's a kind of sucking mechanism to take all the money and the resources for like retail and medical out of the community. And our towns that are in the smart category, not by their choice, I can promise you, are not near highways. And so this is a kind of problem because I went to talk to the Northwest Iowa League of Cities, and I got like a lot of negative reaction when I was not thrilled for them that the highway near them just got widened and that they're doing all this economic development because they're expecting with the wider highway that somehow they're going to capture people from the road to come to do shopping or something in town. Not going to happen. But this is the mindset, growth, growth, growth. Biggest issue at the moment, and this has just come about in the last 3 months. So I started this work 2 years ago, In the last 2 months, I've taken on a completely different sense of urgency about this, and we're actually doing an event in Ames in August about the Mississippi River watershed and its communities. So I'm sure you've seen in the news, the only coverage other than this rural stuff are the floods. And so the Missouri River, the Mississippi River have been flooding, catastrophically flooding. And you can see here, this is the NOAA map that was put out on March 21st. This is in the middle, literally in the middle of the major flood along the Missouri. Those purple areas of the worst major flood category for this year are the bookends of Iowa, the Missouri River and the Mississippi River. So here we have from the New York Times, just relatively recently, what makes a catastrophic flood? Is it climate change causing more of them? Of our 7 towns, it just happened that Hamburg is one of them, so we spent time interviewing people last summer in Hamburg. So it's a town I know, and suddenly it's on the cover of the New York Times because it's totally underwater. So here's my research photo that I showed at the start, and this is the same place. Interesting to me is I sense that when you guys look at this photo where it says the Hamburg market, you think the flood has shut the market down. The market's been closed for years, and there's not been another business in that building, and just the sign is left. But my sense is that this photo that was in the New York Times, people look like, oh, the grocery store got closed by the flood. No, the grocery store got closed because Walmart's 15 minutes away, and there's no reason to have a grocery store where everything costs a lot of money. That's what they were sad about it, but they basically said the economics don't work. So Hamburg is a very interesting case. In our interviews, we heard a lot about floods. FEMA, a few years ago, made a flood map after 2011 when the town was hit badly with flooding, although not this badly. They made a flood map, and they basically redlined the entire downtown. Part of Hamburg is on a hill. They basically said all your flat land is not insurable anymore. And that was going to kick in earlier this year. And they told us how mad they were. There's this whole long story about a hand-built levee or a tractor. The town built their own levee to try to keep the water out in 2011, and it worked, but then the Corps of Engineers made them take it down because it wasn't legal. It wasn't built to legal specs. Anyway, the town felt that FEMA had doomed them by saying that they were going to be flooded, and yet here we are, totally flooded. So, and really underwater. You can see here, this is combined. And this is in the Luss Hills, if any of you know this geography. This is basically an ancient riverbed, and it has hills to the side, and the towns, because the soil is amazing, because it's ancient riverbed, the towns are all dotted along this ancient riverbed, but it's completely flat, like a table, so when the water rises, the water just fills the whole entire space, and it's obvious. I mean, this is like, so there's no way around it. Okay, here's Davenport, just earlier this week. I don't know if you heard about this. This is on the other side of the state, Davenport, Iowa. Flood-hit Midwest, mayors see climate change as a subject best avoided. And if you read the article, it basically says that mayors are concerned if they talk about climate change that the right-wing people in their city will not vote for them, thinking that they're like on some liberal agenda. And so they try to talk about it without using the term climate change. Davenport's interesting because the city decided not to put in a permanent levee. I don't know how many of you know of this whole story, but they have sandbags that line the river, and they're supposed to just go up when there's a threat of flood and then come down. But for the last however many years, few years, they've been up permanently, just all these sandbags, and they were no match for the flooding this year. And so you can see this is the sort of edge of the water at the worst of the flood, and this is all busy downtown, revitalized, rehabbed bars, restaurants, just completely underwater. This is the bank. This is where it's receded back a little bit, but Davenport made this choice for this reason, that if Davenport and other cities in the upper part of the river put more and more levees and higher walls, it floods the communities downstream even more. So towns without levees do this as a choice to allow the river to overflow. And this is the case in a place called Grafton, Illinois. The problem is that as more levees go up due to pressure, for political economic pressure, the ones that still don't have the levees are getting hit. And basically Grafton is downstream from Davenport, and this article is about the fact that Grafton has a choice to not have levees, and its architecture, its landscape is built for the first floor of their buildings to flood. But the flood was so high this time that it submerged everything way above the first floor, and it devastated the town. So in other words, these old systems to say we will flood, there's too much water. Climate change and what's going on upstream is too much. Okay. So I'm an academic and I have lots of text, and I'm just going to very quickly tell you that there's vocabulary that we are trying to use and understand. So urban decline, a downward trajectory of several indicators: economic performance, labor force, demographic changes with negative consequences. Okay. Popper and other people have adapted this to something called smart decline. And they propose that one response to shrinking population should be to plan for fewer people, fewer buildings, and fewer land uses. And this is building off of their well-known idea of the Buffalo Commons for the space west of the Missouri River. Also, another term involved here, urban shrinkage. The team in Leipzig that did that big project, they define urban shrinkage as, quote, an empirical phenomenon resulting from the specific interplay of different macro processes at the local scale, resulting in population loss. So when we come to the question of the research, and we're looking at rural communities, our question is like, do these terms help us? Can we use them? So our hypothesis is that when decline and shrinkage are used as equivalents, like a shrinking place, a declining place, the negative connotations of decline transfer over to discussions of right sizing, with the idea that place can be smaller and also better after a major downward trajectory. So Detroit, we can just take Detroit as an example, went through catastrophic population loss. Peak is 2 million, they're about 680,000 right now, if I have my numbers right. And the idea is they can right size into a city of 680,000. So the focus in those right sizing conversations is that the population loss itself is a negative indicator and has to be stabilized, so you have to stop moving people. Once that's done, cities should address what's perceived as excess infrastructure and right size. So you think about places that have talked about tearing down abandoned houses, turning off some of the utilities to areas of town with very few people and trying to move those people into the center of town. This is right sizing. Through our research, we know that these definitions do not work for rural places, because rural places have experienced shrinkage as shrinking population, school consolidation, aging infrastructure without funds to repair it, loss of retail stores, and loss of most medical services, although in some cases that's not the case. Therefore, there's no excess capacity in these places, and there's no option to right size. So Detroit, even though it's 2 million down to 680,000, it's still a big city full of all sorts of opportunities for the people left. When a little town goes from 800 to 600, there's nothing that can really be done when all the stores are closed, all the schools closed, the water is not drinkable, by EPA standards, all this stuff. Right sizing is not the solution because there's not excess. So can we still protect quality of life, and how to do it? So why are some small communities able to protect quality of life? This is the research question, as they're losing people. We developed a quadrant analysis. We have these 4 research terms: decline, smart shrinking, thriving, and adverse growing. And just very quickly, decline is when shrinkage affects quality of life in quantitative and qualitative data. Smart shrinking is that the shrinkage has not negatively affected perceptions of quality of life. Thriving is both sets of indicators up, more people, better quality of life. And then we have in Iowa a particular phenomenon in the meatpacking towns in particular, where you have growing population, but negative trends on quality of life perceptions. So in other words, like in Wilmar, for some people in Minnesota, a meat packing plant recruits a lot of Mexican labor, both documented and undocumented. Your population increases by quite a lot in some cases, yet if you survey English speakers in those towns, they say that the town is, going to hell, basically. That they don't want to be in the place anymore because it's been overrun by Mexicans. And the racism and this aspect of the work came through very strongly in a lot of our interviews, and I want to state this up front just to say that, as I said, we were listening and learning, and this is something that exists and it's out in the open. And so adverse growing are places where at least a certain population feels that the town, even if it has more people, is not on a positive trajectory. Oh, okay, I lost a bunch of text here. Oh, here we go, okay. So how do you define shrink? Faster than average population loss. How do you define smart? This is my sociologist colleague's slides. Faster than average gains in quality of life. And what's a small town? Any municipality in our study between 500 and 10,000 people, not adjacent to a city of 50,000 or more in 1990. And because I'm already talking too much, I'm going to run through this a little bit quickly, and I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to really know more about the research methodology. But the base of our work is the Iowa Small Towns Project that's been running something called the Iowa Small Town Poll. In 1994, 2004, and 2014, surveys were sent out to residents of 99 Iowa communities. To be eligible to be one of these poll communities, in 1990's census, you had to be a community of 500 to 10,000 people, and they randomly selected one from each of the 99 counties, we don't know how, out of a hat or something. And those 99 communities are now poll communities, and every 10 years they get a survey, at first in the mail, and now it's done digitally. And they might do it every 5 years now, but essentially we have this great base of quality of life data run out of the sociology department and ISU Extension and Outreach, and it's very specific to quality of life. So what we did was we took some of the data from the ISTP, the Iowa Small Town Poll, and the sociologist on my team did a regression analysis, and he did all kinds of data work on the existing data set to create quadrants. These are the ones I talked about before. On the left, you can see decline and adverse growth on my left, and the other side, thrive and smart shrinkage. You can understand these as those four that I described, a mix of quality of life trends and population trends. And here you can see a map. The orange ones are the original 99, and as I said, one in each of the 99 counties. I mentioned that there's 944 towns in Iowa, but there's also 99 counties, which is a lot. So here are the 99 small town poll communities on a map, color-coded for the category on the quadrant analysis. And essentially what we did, we had 7 that came up as shrink smart, meaning that they have better trends on quality of life than the data would suggest that they should have, and 2 that were declining. Their quality of life measures were worse than expected. Okay? And when Dave, my sociology colleague, ran all of his numbers, he was able to generate these kinds of graphs. Changing quality of life from 1994, for example, in the areas that we were looking at in our data. The blue bars are the smart shrink or shrink smart towns, and the orange are the declining ones, so things are getting worse. In every one of these categories, the groups that fall into those parts of the quadrant, you can see here that the shrink smart towns were doing better. Right? And in terms of change, like look at the senior services, for example. In the declining towns, the rating, this is self-perception, the rating on the poll of senior services went just off a cliff. And in the opposite direction for the towns that are doing better, child services, medical services, jobs, these are going in a very positive direction since 1994. Okay? So Dave has all this data that I'm going to quickly run through to get to the back end so that we have some time for questions. So smart shrinking and declining towns are very similar in terms of demographics. This is something I really want to stress. That's why when we talk about what are the recommendations, we're focused on building social capital, because that is what we have found from our interviews and from all of our data that seems to matter most to people. So in declining, these are shrinking places. They're equivalent shrinkage in a lot of cases. Okay, same population, same percentage change loss. The smart shrinking ones are less densely populated. It's just a quirk in the data. The smarter towns are not near large metros, not near major highways, and not near natural amenities. And that's easy in Iowa, the last one, because we have almost no natural amenities. We rank like 49th out of 50th for natural amenities. Elders matter. The elder population in our shrink smart towns is larger, statistically larger, and they can be a community resource. Okay? Employment. They have higher percentages of year-round jobs and shorter commutes, although some of us question this commuting data, but we use the loads data from the census. Let's say that they have shorter commutes. There is, more manufacturing jobs, particularly goods producing. The key here, middle skill, middle wages with benefits, full-time, full-year, and suited to the labor force. So these are not necessarily highly skilled jobs. Some of the places in our study have things like a popcorn plant in town, a place that makes salsa in one of the towns, small machine shops, those kinds of places. They have an agricultural business that makes agricultural equipment. So it's not that these are highly educated people, but they are full-time, full-year with benefit jobs. Fewer low-end service jobs. And because of this, statistically, there's less poverty in our shrink smart towns. And Iowa in general is in decent shape compared to a lot of places. I'm going to skip this. Anybody who wants to look at charts with me, I will look with you later. Okay, so smart shrinking towns are better than declining towns on social capital measures. Stronger bonding social ties. They're more trusting and supportive of their neighbors. They have close friends and relatives. And when we say more, this is when we look at our data and compare declining towns that should be the same, according to all of the data, with the shrink smart towns. So these are the things that matter to people when they say their quality of life is better. More trusting and supportive, strong attachment, stronger and persistent bridging social ties. Organizations work for everyone. New residents are allowed to take leadership roles. There's tolerance in the community for difference. And in particular, the rating that people have, is your town open to new ideas, is statistically much higher in the shrink smart towns. And we are really interested in this part. The town promotes collective action. So, meaning if there's a problem, the town together addresses it. They also have more linkages inside and outside. There's lots of people who are joiners in these communities, at least that's a term that we used growing up. They like to be in clubs. They're in clubs in town, they're in clubs out of town. They like to get together, and this is the way that they build up this social capital. And I think it's a remnant of the farm days when everyone was very isolated and these clubs gave some kind of social network. Okay, civic engagement. Half of the residents in our Shrink Smart town participated in at least one community project last year. This is a huge number, although 43% in the declining places did as well. They have confidence in their town. They feel that their town, statistically, they feel it's safer, better kept up, and they're more optimistic about the town. So, what are our recommendations when I talk to communities? We say that rather than going after economic development projects, like building a concrete pad by the highway exit in your town, hoping that a call center will go there, we say promote civic engagement and social capital, more participation in local projects, encourage membership, both locally and outside, and especially encourage people to be open to new ideas, because this makes the whole community feel more optimistic. Use your elders. They have time, they have local connections, they have resources often, they can mentor younger people. The problem is how to keep your elders actually in the community if you do not invest in senior services. And probably this group doesn't need to know more than me just saying that this really matters to older people, especially the ones with money. The senior services are not just for poor people. This is community spaces. This is having a medical clinic, even if it's with a doctor coming once a week. Just things that really make seniors feel safe in the community. The reasons we say these are primary: they're inexpensive to implement, they're actionable in the near term, and the community has control over them. So all three of these for little towns, this really matters. You need to be able to do things, to be action-oriented. This is what we're trying to help people. Secondarily, and of course everybody wants this, but manufacturing, construction, and mining, this is the segment of the poll, the census data as well. You want to try to get these, and everyone knows this, but I guess the point here is that this is not necessarily high-skilled, college-educated workforce jobs. You want jobs that match your labor force. You can't try to start a tech startup in one of these little towns. I promise you it's virtually impossible unless the founders are from the town, which in Iowa every once in a while happens, and then it's splashed across the newspaper that this is the solution to rural shrinkage, and of course it's not. So economic security, active citizens, good quality of life, eliminates social problems but does not stop the population loss, and this is what we're really trying to broadcast out. Don't be so concerned that the population is going down. It is not in the town's control. It's about macroeconomics, right? So why are these secondary? These all require sizable funding, long-term planning, and the community has really little control over the national and the global economy. So just to show you a little bit about what we did for research, we made these incredible maps with my urban design colleague to understand the ecosystem in terms of these things. Industry, hospitals, roads, waterways, public parks, and then the drive distance, the drive time distance. So on this map from Murray's right here, this little red dot. And so we are trying to understand essentially its job shed, and we're trying to figure out what's around Murray. Murray is one of our declining towns. It's one of the saddest places I've ever visited, and it's got nothing left but some houses, and they told us that a lot of people who have drug problems live there because the landlords have no one else to rent to, and the whole place is really falling apart. But we wanted to understand, like I said, as an ecosystem. Here is Sac City in much better shape. You can see it's right on the highway, and you can see its work shed, and it has some jobs around. Sac City is unusual in our study because it's a county seat, so it's our biggest town, 2,100 people, and it has the backbone of a county infrastructure, a courthouse, lawyers, kind of a professional staff around, a great city manager. Here's Sheffield, a very unusual type. It's a company town. They still exist. This is the home of Sukup Manufacturing, now has 600 employees. This is Sheffield, founded at the edge of town by local residents. It's now a huge multi-million, trillion-dollar, billion-dollar company, I don't know what, but they are so rich that they have purchased buildings for Iowa State, like Sukup name is all over Iowa State campus, and the families, the founding owner just died earlier this year, but the family's still around, but all the kids have left to nearby communities, and Sheffield itself, adjacent to this huge manufacturing center, is shrinking. And this is a crazy thing to think, but the problem is housing. There's been no new housing construction in Sheffield in a long time, and they can't get developers who want to come into the town to build houses, so this is a whole other part of the conversation. We also have data science piece to this. So we're using our unique longitudinal data set as a base and trying to build proxy metrics, proxy measures to give similar results. And this is the piece that NSF is most interested in, but it's the piece that has been slower and challenging. So the goals for the data, we wanted to try to estimate through social media and publicly available data and administrative data. We've been trying to build proxy metrics that produce for us a similar reading of the towns as the poll. So do the 99 towns when we do this kind of data science with machine learning, can we generate a list that looks similar when we ask the questions about smartness and decline? Because we want to be able to generalize some of our work to other places where we don't have the longitudinal data set. Hopefully that makes sense. These were chosen, or we're looking for data sets that have high dimensionality, meaning that there's many things in the data to look at. Our data scientists picked 76 initial features, and that's a lot. And many features are graph and geospatial centric. And so he started to build little diagrams like this. Elma, Iowa, 512 people, is our best town for just tons and tons of reasons. And they also have high connectivity to other places, and that's what this visualization is about. So Eric's description says, on the left we have Elma, a shrink-smart community with excellent outcomes. Elma is very connected to its neighbors, and the people of Elma form a local interdependent community. On the right is Correctionville, a community whose outcomes were not quite as good. They actually kind of sank down to decline once we looked more carefully. People in Correctionville aren't very connected. They tend to try and meet their needs in the home community and a small number of other communities. They're within striking distance of Sioux City, Iowa, but still outside of our metro calculation. They're less connected to surrounding areas, and this seems to have an impact on their perceptions of quality of life. Here's another little visualization of healthy and unhealthy neighborhoods of jobs. Elma, they told us that people commute up to an hour, but they go in 360-degree directions. Like, people are going everywhere. They're all coming home at night to this little town. In Correctionville, there's just a few places that people are going, and Eric is trying to kind of visualize the sense of connectivity. So Elma, this is from another presentation, sorry, it's a little hard for you to see, but we have developed 3 typologies. The idea of a county seat, of a company town, and then the one that maybe is most interesting to you guys, a place that we called home to local champions. These are places where there are individuals in the town working really hard to make the town better. Okay. So I want to end by talking as quickly as I can about the ways in which rural shrinkage is different than urban shrinkage, and I'm hoping that in me talking about this that we can kind of generate a conversation. So for example, right sizing is not easily applied. Networks of services, education, and shopping have expanded into larger territories and into the internet, or to the internet. All shrinking communities are experiencing some negative change, and therefore they're vulnerable to decline. So in other words, these are communities, even in our shrink smart category, they're still very vulnerable and on the edge and could kind of head downward in quality of life pretty quickly. So I just want to run through these 6 paradigms that we've developed for rural shrinkage. And these, I hope, matter to you guys in thinking about your place in that, especially those of you in growing urban areas. So rural shrinkage is slow. It's not always visible in the day-to-day lives of people, so people don't think of it as a crisis. Okay? The people in these towns are not expecting to grow since they feel their places have always been about the same size as little farming towns. Okay? It's not like a place like Liverpool, England that lost half its population. In a rural place, children might leave home for college and not come back. Families might have fewer children because the farm doesn't require so much labor. This population change happens over time. It's not an exodus. So we found that in some towns, they didn't even know they were shrinking. We came and said, you're a shrinking town, they didn't know. People told us that they thought the population was stable and that they don't feel like they live in a shrinking community. So people in the worst towns that we looked at, the declining towns, said that they really felt the shrinkage, even if the number of people who had left was similar to the other town. Right? This is the sort of perception part of the research. Rural places have an existential question of whether or not they can survive. They're changing from small to really small, and it can feel as if the town is disappearing. This is different than in cities. Cities think about what form they might take in the future and what qualities they can market to potential newcomers or investors. Cities are alive and transforming, as opposed to rural places that even the better ones can feel stagnant and that they're not changing. This is an important one for me. Fewer people live in rural communities as a percentage of the total population because of growth in urban and suburban areas, not because of large-scale population loss in most rural communities. Okay? The significance is in the context of purposeful action. Rural smart shrinkage as a process must take into account the inherent conservatism of the communities. They are remaining relatively the same while other places are changing. If people in the community do adapt by becoming more open to change and more open to new leaders, it's difficult to encourage collective action and increase bridging social capital, which we know as actions that lead to improved perceptions of quality of life. So if people do not adapt. So if they can't be more open to new leadership, they can't be open to change, collective action becomes very difficult when problems arise. But the point here is that these places are as they have been. They're almost identical to the 50s, the 60s. They're all white. They're very middle class with some rich farmers around. And they think the world around them has left them behind, is not understanding them, but they don't understand why they have to change because it's just always been the same. And this is where the politics part comes in. Like, these are the voters that we have in the country that are voting differently than from some of us would like them to. So powerful cultural forces are behind rural population loss. It's not about economics. This is so critical. We hypothesize that younger people want to live in more secular, diverse, and open-minded communities. Exposure to new ideas and different people happens at college, it happens in a job outside of town, and then it's really hard to return back to this place that hasn't changed. So in urban settings, this is not as much of a problem because cities are already more diverse, less conformist, and more open-minded. Even in struggling places, there is diversity. Our interview showed that people who stay in the communities are more conservative on the things that we talked about. For example, nervous about LGBTQ, nervous about people who have different skin color from them. We've heard a lot about not moving out of town because they're scared to live near people who don't look like them or who they don't know. And religion, though, is not mentioned as much as we expected. And if anyone's interested, we can talk about that. We heard nothing about churches. We also hear that you cannot be as ambitious in your professional life in these communities, so the choice to stay is seen as a compromise for professional advancement. So people were saying to us, I chose to stay and I knew my career would be affected, but it's my choice. The profile of people who leave rural places is different than people who leave urban places. People have always left small towns for bigger places and better opportunities. People leave rural towns not because the place has changed, but it no longer fits their life aspirations. We describe this as the pull of the new place. People are drawn out from small towns, whereas in the city, especially in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was a push. People leave cities because of problems. Property values go down, or like in Durham, go way up. Racial demographics change. People who have resources then have more choices, in the case of white flight, left. So they go to suburbs, for example. So in post-industrial contexts, jobs leave. People also have new jobs in the service and technology sectors. So everything moves to the suburbs. So the point here is you're pushed out of the city, at least in the earlier times, and then there's a pull to something better out of the rural places. These are different mechanisms. Rural places struggle to develop a complex and layered identity beyond being a service center for the farms nearby. This goes to my very early point that this is about the scale of farming. So there's fewer farming families, they need fewer services, and the economic portfolio of these towns has to diversify, but there's no real way to do it. So cities don't have that problem as much. Cities can reshape themselves. There's bigger number of people and resources. And this is maybe the most interesting thing that we found. Communities that appear as shrink smart often have these local champions who choose to volunteer time to community betterment. Many are wealthier and older than the typical residents, so we might call them local elites. But the interesting thing is they generally feel very committed to the vision of their town as it was before. So they are working really hard to bring back the town that they remember of their childhood. And they're not necessarily promoting change and openness and that sort of stuff. So the last thing I want to say is we're working with this idea that smart shrinkage is a kind of adaptation that is involved with resiliency. So one of the team researchers is a resiliency expert, and she talks about resiliency having static features and capacities and adaptive processes. This is a sort of bedrock of resiliency literature. And we're thinking that this is a useful parallel with smart shrinkage, that towns have features that we can find in public data sources like education level, median age, median income, income inequality, etc. The questions that we're trying to get to are what are the adaptive processes in place to respond, and we're describing this shrinkage as a slow-moving disaster. So if a tornado hits, it's a disaster right there. We're saying over time, this kind of slow move away from these rural communities and the inability of them to change in a lot of cases, that this is a slow-moving disaster, and maybe the resiliency literature about how to be resilient in the face of some kind of crisis is useful. So these are some questions that we kind of put out there in this context. Do you have a lot of NGOs in your community? We find the better towns have huge infrastructure for NGO. The town with 512 people has $750,000 in its community foundation account, and they run festivals and events all year long for the 500 people. How open is city government to new representation? What are the contexts in which to build bridges and social capital, bridging and linking social capital? And then how much philanthropy and volunteer time do people give? This is the additional time and money in response to population loss are adaptations to shrinkage that would fit well in this idea that maybe what we need to do is think more about the resiliency framework, the resiliency literature, about addressing this as a slow-moving disaster and thinking about how to be resilient in the face of this disaster. So I'm going to leave it here. This is, I ran my whole hour, or almost my whole hour, but I would love to get some questions if Ben is okay with that. And this is my contact for anybody who wants, outside of right now or today, wants to get in touch. So.
First of all, thank you. That was really enlightening. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
My name is Megan. I work for the City of Norfolk, Virginia, and this is maybe just a more personal question. I was wondering, when you did your research, you talked a little bit about tolerance and racism and how that influences what happens in these small cities. And because your quality of life survey was all self-perception, I was just wondering if you found any correlations between like the response to the quality of life questions and the level of diversity, or like...
There is no diversity in these towns.
Oh, really?
Nothing.
Okay.
So diversity, there may be a few families who are Mexicans, for example, undocumented or documented. In one of our declining towns, there's a small Mexican population, relatively new, that has to do with moving their kids there for better schools from the meatpacking town. And we don't think that they were in the survey because the last survey that we looked at was 2014 and they weren't there. But Iowa as a state is something like 93 or 94% white, and the diverse populations are really clustered in cities and bigger towns. So we literally found no diversity except for the few Mexicans in this one town. And so what we do find, though, is the question of outsiders. You can be from a town 5 miles down the road and you're a total outsider for like even 20 years later. They think of you as an outsider. So in that sense, there is diversity, or there's questions of diversity about outsiders. But the outsiders look like them and talk like them and come from the same cultural context. We found a lot of inter-town rivalries. One of the propositions that I have, and I was talking to somebody about, is, you know, some of these towns should disincorporate, and we should try to encourage more people to live in clustered places so that there's fewer towns, less infrastructure that has to be saved. There's a whole long, complicated thing about that. You know, Iowa's water quality is terrible. A lot of the water is poisoned by farm runoff, and we're about to, you know, keep pumping money into all of this to protect infrastructure for tiny places. But if you ask people in these towns, would you ever move 10 miles down the road? Your kids already go to school in that town. You already know a lot of people in that town. We heard things like, oh, they're not our kind of people. I would never live there. And this is a shocking thing because I come from a more mobile, kind of educated class of people and from a context in which a lot of people move. A lot of these people's families have been there for generations, and they really feel place attachment in a really deep level, and so these are hard conversations to have. Yeah.
So my name is Nathan Masson. I'm currently in Gaithersburg, Maryland, but my question for you is, one of the questions that a lot of our communities have is about affordable housing, and that obviously is something that these communities could potentially provide. Do you see any kind of movement as we move more toward telecommuting and things like this, where there's a possibility for remote work in these communities to become a thing?
Yeah, thank you so much. So a couple things, and I'm going to sound like harsh and quick on this, but fiber is not an answer to anything in Iowa, internet connectivity, because everyone already has internet pretty much, and if they can't get it through the ground, they get it from satellite. All farmers have to have it. They've had satellite internet for 20 years because all their combines and everything run off of satellite data, so they're very connected. And this is totally to the social capital question. If you could buy a house that was of the quality that you want, like a decent, kept up, good suburban house, for 10% of what you pay in Gaithersburg, would you move to a town of 500 people in the middle of Iowa? Right. So this is why this growth and this economic development through internet, remote jobs, for us is a really false, fake conversation. People want to live with other people who they like, where there's cultural amenities, people who have similar mindsets, education levels. All we see is a small boomerang. In Iowa, they always talk about the boomerang. Kids from little towns went to college, left, and then they come back to Iowa, but only a fraction of them go to their little town. There are huge numbers of these kids in Ankeny, suburb of Des Moines, West Des Moines, near Iowa City. They still are in Iowa. Iowa's population is not shrinking as a whole. We have some super growing suburbs, and those kids grew up in the little towns, and they can't even think for a minute about living there. And these are my students at Iowa State. They come from all the little towns, they spend a semester in Rome, they get a job in Dallas. 10 years later, they have 2 kids, and they want a cheap house, and they move back to the suburbs of Des Moines. They don't go anywhere near these little towns. And so the idea that we can promise people that if you lay fiber, if there's good connectivity in your little town, that people are going to come, this doesn't make any sense as a cultural conversation. And especially for people of color in the room, you can't even imagine this. It doesn't matter how cheap the house is, right? So I think it's very important to be honest and open. But to the affordable housing question, the communities all tell us that the developers will not work in their communities. Iowa developers, there's many kind of big kind of corporate developers. They don't want any part of these communities. They consider them too high risk. Because if your population is shrinking, the real estate metrics say that that's a risky investment, even though there's actually quite high demand for new houses. Because what's happened is that the housing stock in a lot of these towns has not been invested in. The same family has owned a house for 80 years, and the 85-year-old, 90-year-old couple that lived there since they brought up their 5 or 6 kids, and they just died. That house has not had a new roof, it hasn't had siding, all this stuff for decades. And in order to go into that little town, it's expensive, I can promise you, because we don't have a migrant labor force. There's very few cheap contractors in Iowa. Ames, Iowa has one of the highest contracting prices in the country because we don't have an undocumented workforce of any sort. And so the cost to renovate a house is obscene. So the point about housing is, yes, these places are affordable by the metrics of most people here, but so is Ames, so is Ankeny, so is Iowa City. I mean, the housing prices in Iowa are cheap. So why go to one of these little towns when you can move to a wonderful, growing, vibrant, diverse place still in Iowa? And so and they're already on fiber, right? So this is not, I hope that I made enough clear points about that. I can go on forever. I just get very frustrated with the economic development consultants who constantly come and constantly promise that the solution is fiber. This is just crazy. Yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah.
That's okay. So I'm glad you talked about the political implications. And although because that's really a great concern to me in the bigger picture. And although I know you're an academic and not a pundit, one of the real, we hear all the time, and we witness all the time, and we work with all the time, the growing divisiveness and divisions in this country. And one of the biggest, I think, is the urban-rural divide, which that map shows. What does your research, or to what extent are you able to speculate on the long-term impact of the rural-urban divide on the future of democracy as we have known it?
So, you can probably tell I pretend to be a pundit a lot, so I have a lot to say about this. But a couple things. Part of the problem for me are the false promises. So what's happening in the rural places is they keep being promised that something is going to get better, and when it doesn't, they get disappointed. And the votes that some of the people in these communities, their votes cast, Obama voters who became Trump voters, for example, in Iowa, they are sick of the false promises. So the fact that we can't have an honest, open conversation, that they keep being told, like you're being deprived of the future in your town because they haven't brought you internet, because you don't have your school anymore because that person in that other town took it. It's like all these disappointments that bring anger that they then use in a political way to kind of act out against the elites that they think are wrecking their towns. If we can be more open and honest about this, and of course this word is very academic, but the macroeconomics, the changes to the global economy, the changes to the agricultural economy, that say that all these towns are struggling to survive when in fact none of them are needed anymore for the economy. Every single town is trying to protect itself because of its 19th century memories of being an important town. But from a purely economic perspective, and I'm not talking about social capital or place attachment or anything, just in a literal sense, none of these little towns are needed. The farms are run by huge machines and very few people. There are still little banks in all these communities. That's not needed, even though they keep a certain kind of civic quality to the place, because the bankers are usually rich and do give to the community a little bit. In Elma, Iowa, our best town, the person leading the charge is the bank president, and he pays his employees actually bank salary to do some of this community work, like on their bank time. So that's just one little bit of it, but to the bigger question about the divide, I'm much more pessimistic about it than I was going into this, because I see that the point of view of, like, okay, Ankeny, Iowa is a very fast growing suburb of Des Moines, between Ames and Des Moines. And one of our declining town interviewees, who is a very racist person and openly so with us and totally not embarrassed about it, he said to me, my son lives in Ankeny, and I would never live there. I can't believe that he lets his kids go out on the street with so many strangers around and so many people who Mexicans could be around, and like he really identified a fear of others as a driving force for staying in his town. And maybe he's an outlier in the town. He's a bus driver, he's kind of a working class guy, but he was on the city council. And he was on the city council because a big trucking operation opened up on the edge of town. His gravel road in front of his house was shooting gravel dust into his garden. And he said, I ran for city council, I'm on the city council because I'm a one-issue guy. I want them to pave the road in front of my house because of the dust going in my garden. So, so he is an elite in that sense, like he's on the city council. But he's very open about, what he thinks about the place. He's like a 70-year-old guy. So I'm not optimistic, I think, about your question. Like, there's not going to be a kind of kumbaya moment between rural and urban people, really. But I think the more that we talk about being open to new ideas, allowing new people into leadership, and then the places like Wilmar, so all the way back to the earlier part of my talk, Tom Friedman sort of says, like, this is the town we need to look at because the number of Somalis and the number of Spanish speakers, they're basically forcing the town to be more accepting, and pretty soon those kids who all went to school together, their high school is majority non-majority students, majority Black and Latino students, even though it's southern Minnesota. That is what's going to change things going forward, is the fact that the kids are growing up together and they won't have all of these, I think, so we have like 30 years to get there in some of these places, but in the meantime, there are all these other places that are not integrating. And so I don't, that's why as an academic, I have no solutions to the really deep problem. I think my students asked me personally how I felt about the Electoral College messages coming from some of the presidential candidates on the left saying that we should get rid of it. And I told them, as students who live in Iowa, even if they're not from there, the last thing that they should want is to get rid of the Electoral College, because the Electoral College makes them and all other Midwesterners super powerful, and if we got rid of it, all the money and resources and efforts would go to coastal cities. And so the Electoral College in its original constitutional intention is about a kind of balance between urban and rural, and so we are in the midst of like really serious cultural upheaval about that as the rural population gets so small that its voice is so outsized in politics. So I think gerrymandering, for me personally, two things: stop the gerrymandering, because that's really screwing things up, and higher minimum wage. These for me are like two things. I am not a Bernie Sanders person, and I will talk to you forever about why, but I'm a historian of socialism, so I can talk to you about that a lot. So we're done. I will talk to anyone who wants to chat later.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. It was amazing. It was one of the most informative presentations I've ever heard, and I told Ben we're going to make stickers. Kimberly, I almost hesitate to make the joke, but I'm at ELGO, so I can. But seriously, Kimberly Z, 2020, that's for real. That's very legit. I really, really love everything she's doing. I'm going to save our announcements about the sponsors before our next keynote, but our breakouts, the 2 o'clock breakouts start now. So if you could, just make your way to your right or to your left to your respective places.